Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Chia, and today I'm going to do a beginner's guide to reading fantasy. There are different categories of fantasy that I love to read. There's so many ranging from YA fantasy, new adult, there's middle grade that you can start off with. There's also dark fantasy romance, there's paranormal fantasy romance, there's also gothic fantasy romance. So the world is your oyster when it comes to fantasy. But I decided to do a beginner's guide to fantasy because I know there's some people out there who don't necessarily want to read fantasy or mainly read other genres that are not fantasy. I am going to give you a sort of comprehensive guide on the fantasies that I would recommend for beginners out there. I might make this a series starting off with beginner, ranging to intermediate, and then maybe go on to expert, but I still haven't gotten to the expert level yet because I'm still making my way over to high epic fantasies, so that I might not make that till later on down the line. But let's get started. I'm going to start off with the middle grade YA category. I only have like technically one middle grade that I read years ago, and that was the Percy Jackson series. This follows a character named obviously Percy Jackson, and he attends a camp called Camp Half-Blood, and you find out that he is a descendant of one of the Greek gods. So if you love Greek mythology and want to get into fantasy, this is a great pick. It's really easy to get into. It's very middle grade. Don't expect like the dialogue to be really mature because it's not. It's literally a bunch of like 12-year-old kids who are talking to each other. That's what it sounds like. But when you get into it, how deep the world gets and how great the story does, you just can't help but getting hooked. If you are looking to start reading fantasy and want to start very slow, this one is great. And even though despite the fact that it's marketed for middle grade, I honestly still think that this is one of the best series I've ever read, and I would love to do a reread soon. So I might do a reread and a reading vlog in the future, but I highly recommend the Percy Jackson series, especially if you're into Greek mythology. Next one, of course, is one of the most popular young adult fantasies of all time, which is the Harry Potter series. This is the first book that ever got me into reading. This is the series that made me fall in love with fantasy, and this is one of the best found family tropes I've ever read. I love the characters' growth in this book. It sort of starts off where they, obviously if you've never heard of Harry Potter before, which I'm sure everyone has, it starts off in the academy setting where you go to Hogwarts with Harry. The first couple of books, like the first and second one, are very centered around him attending Hogwarts and the daily adventures that he and his friends get into. But once you get further on into the series, it starts getting darker and darker, and it starts getting really less like YA because there's so many things that are so dark that happens to Harry and a lot of his friends too. And the story of like basically they're in the middle of a war against like an evil villain who is trying to take over their world. So it gets really deep, and it's really easy to get into because sort of get what it is right away once you start reading this. So I would highly recommend starting this off. I read this when I was 12 and I found it very easy to get into and fell in love with the series, and it's like near and dear to my heart. So I will highly recommend for Harry Potter to be read first if you're trying to get into fantasy. Next book I would recommend is the Shatter Me series. This is more mixed with sort of like a dystopian world and fantasy mixed together. Just imagine like sort of the X-Men world where it's more of that kind of ability based rather than magic based, where there's like different humans who have different abilities. This book follows a character named Juliet, and Juliet sort of has a very deadly power that I'm not going to get into because you should read it for yourself. And she finds out that there's other people who have these abilities as well, and she starts attending sort of like an institution slash academy where she starts practicing with her power to control it, even though it's deadly, even though she's been stuck in an institution for a long time because of the fact that she can kill people with her powers. And one day she gets broken out of this institution because she runs into a childhood friend of hers. And of course, if you are around Book Talk or Bookstagram, you know about Aaron Warner and you heard about how people love him as a book boyfriend, and I love him too, even though there's other people who I think are way better ever since I read this book. But very highly recommend this book as well. The writing is kind of weird at the beginning because it's told through the perspective of Juliet, and Juliet is sort of kind of like losing her mind inside this institution. You could tell through her journey through the writing because it's sort of like disorienting writing, but once she starts sort of like moving away from the institution, it starts getting better. So it sort of follows her mental journey as well. So I highly recommend this series also. you. It's a 6-book series, it's huge, and also there's like a bunch of different novellas. You do not have to read the novellas, they're sort of like just additions to it. I haven't read any of the novellas besides the last one that comes after the last book of Shatter Me, but I would highly recommend this book. If you're coming from like sort of like Hunger Games and how it's sort of dystopian and you're trying to get into fantasy, this one would be a good bet because they are living in sort of like a dystopian world. Next YA recommendation I would have is Shadow and Bone. Shadow and Bone is set in the Grisha-verse universe, and Grishas are sort of like the magical beings in this world, and not every single human in this world has a power, so they're divided between the Grisha and other humans who are not magical. And this follows a character named Lena, and Lena is a sort of like a cartographer, a part of the army, and one day she runs into a character named the Darkling, and he helps her discover that she does have power because all of a sudden she has a burst of power when they're trying to travel through this like dark expanse of the world where a lot of people are attacked once they get into like this void, and she somehow manages to escape and save the people who are with her as well, and she starts getting trained into the Grisha-verse, and it's such a huge world. I really like. I love this universe so much. Shadow and Bone was not my favorite series because the series after this is my favorite series in this world, but this one is more of a introduction to that world and it's easier to get into because the next book after it is Six of Crows, and Six of Crows sort of just takes you straight into the story. It doesn't take the time to flesh out the world, it kind of just assumes that you already know what's going on. But I absolutely loved Six of Crows, and if anything, if you want to learn about the world without, you know, getting really confused, I would start off with the Shadow and Bone trilogy first before Six of Crows. Six of Crows is a lot more intermediate. And then the next book is Caraval. Caraval, just imagine like Trials and Games set in sort of like a carnival based world, and you got Caraval. Caraval is a trilogy and it follows two sisters who are invited to come to Caraval and participate in the contest. I love the Caraval world because you are not too sure what's going on. You can't really tell what's real, what's true, nothing like that, and it's a love story also. It's very beginner friendly because the moment you start reading the book you understand what's going on because the world is not that complex, and if you love carnivals type games, this would be for you. And coming from that same Caraval world is Once Upon a Broken Heart. I absolutely love Once Upon a Broken Heart a lot more than Caraval. Caraval is, again, just like Shadow and Bone, is a great introduction into the world. You don't have to read Caraval in order to understand what's going on in Once Upon a Time. Once Upon a Time is more fairy tale based. The only thing that's really the main connection towards it is a character named Jax, who is an immortal fate, is introduced later on in the series, so you kind of like see his backstory in here, and then you start seeing him more in here because he's the male main character. And I absolutely love Jax. He's very morally gray. He doesn't give a crap about anything and he wants everything for himself, and he's very kind of like selfish fate, which is all the immortal fates are, very selfish. They're all about personal gain. Evangeline is a female main character, and she unfortunately has to watch her stepsister marry the love of her life, and of course she doesn't want that to happen, so she makes a deal with immortal fate that if he stops the wedding from happening, Jax will take 3 favors in return, and his favor is 3 kisses, and he can call on these 3 kisses whenever he wants. Then kisses are not towards him, he can use that kiss towards anybody that he wants, and that's the deal it strikes. And then throughout their journey you start slowly seeing them start like kind of fall for each other, and the tension in this book is so good. And I love the fairy tale aspect of it because it takes Caraval world but puts it more whimsical. I love the writing in this book and I absolutely highly recommend this. Next is Cruel Prince. Cruel Prince is a trilogy that follows a character named Jude. Jude is a human, and Jude and her 2 sisters get taken away to the fairy world because unfortunately her parents end up getting murdered. And in the fairy world they are ridiculed and bullied because they are humans, and unfortunately she doesn't have anyone to kind of turn to because nobody likes her in this world. And then she ends up kind of getting involved into this like political game with a character named Cardin, and Cardin is one of the princes of this world. And let's just say there's so much tension in this, but be prepared, there's a lot of betrayal in this. You can not trust anybody in this world. Jude is pretty much fending for herself in this world, and I'm still kind of iffy about the ending because like there was so much betrayal between some of the characters that I'm just like, I don't know if I could fully trust anybody at that point after what happens. All in all, I do like the characters, and if you want want sort of like a more grittier world and more sort of Grimm's fairy tales world, this would be a better bet because it's a lot grittier and everyone is out for themselves. There's nobody who's nice to each other in this book. And I don't know, I binged it anyways, and I was kind of hesitant on going into it because I know that a lot of people had mixed reviews about it, but somebody said online that to go into this looking at it as a fantasy with political based plot rather than, you know, a romance. And that's what I expected going in, and I pleasantly liked it. I didn't think I would because it was sitting on my shelf for so many months, but I ended up devouring all 3 of these books. And of course, I can't talk about YA fantasy without talking about Twilight. Twilight is another book, again, that I read when I was younger, where it got me deep into fantasy. If you like vampires, werewolves, that kind of fantasy, then you would love this book. But be prepared, it's very cringy. Also a love triangle, the worst love triangle I've ever read in my life, but it's very, very cringy. It's sort of like if you watch The Vampire Diaries and also, I guess, Teen Wolf as well. This is the book that came before any of those shows came about. So it's very binge-worthy. There's 4 books, and I'm sure everyone has heard about it by now because the book has been everywhere for the past few years. But it's a love story between Bella and Edward, and I guess sort of like another person as well who's Jacob. And I binged the series when I was younger. I absolutely loved it, and it's, despite how cringy it is now, I still look forward to watching the movies every single year, and I'm hoping to get my hands on the 10th anniversary, I think it is, that's coming out in September. It's a hardcover thing. I'll show a picture up here if you want to look at it, and I'm hoping to get my hands on it. I did pre-order it from Amazon, but we'll see if I end up getting it because I know Amazon has been messing up with a lot of orders lately, especially for pre-orders, so I might order it from somewhere else if I can. But yes, for sure, if you want a beginner fantasy, definitely Twilight. And the next book I would recommend that the series recently got completed is the Crimson Moth duology. Crimson Moth is what it's known in the UK. I got the UK cover, and in the US it's called Heartless Hunter. I still don't know why it got 2 different titles, but here we are. I absolutely love this duology. I recently finished the second one called The Rebel Witch, and it follows a witch and a witch hunter, and it follows Rune, who is a witch, and she is known as a Crimson Moth. In this world, being a witch is illegal because of like the past witches who kind of took over the whole entire land, but they were cruel and evil, and then they got usurped. The mortals took over, so they started purging every single witch that was in this world, and she is a hidden witch, and she is tasked herself to rescue all the witches who have ever been imprisoned. And she is a vapid socialite by day, and at night she's the Crimson Moth. And then there's Gideon, who is a witch hunter. He is actually in charge of all the witch hunters. And Rune and Gideon sort of play a cat and mouse game with each other. Gideon has suspicions that it's her who's the Crimson Moth because of some ship manifestos that he found that has Rune's name on it, or her family name on there. Rune is trying to find protection to get suspicion off of her, then to start courting the leader of the witch hunters. So it's sort of like a back and forth between them, and it's a witch hunter kind of like romance, and I love the back and forth between them. It's sort of like an enemies to lovers kind of story, and I absolutely love the banter and the tension between these 2 characters because they both have personal agendas. Both of them are trying to betray each other. So it's a good fantasy to start because the world is set in Regency era, and it's not really heavy on the world building. Just imagine them being Regency era with characters who have magical powers. And the next one is, of course, the whole entire Shadowhunter universe. Shadowhunters are sort of half angels who are tasked to chase demons out from their world. This book is the first book in the Infernal Devices trilogy. It's called Clockwork Angel. But if you want to start off with more of like a world building kind of aspect to get the feel of the Shadowhunter universe, I would suggest starting off with City of Bones series. This book technically, chronologically comes before that one, but that one I feel like it's a lot easier to understand the world more because this one kind of does the same thing that Six of Crows does, where it just sort of plops you into the world and it kind of expects you to understand what's going on. It's like this one is more set in 1800s, and City of Bones is urban fantasy and is set in New York, and this one is set in London. This one I prefer over City of Bones, although I only read the first 3 of City of Bones in high school. This one I read the whole entire trilogy, and this one I feel like is the superior one. It has a better plot in this book. I love the characters more in this book. That's a great thing about Cassandra Clare's books, is because she knows how to write tension. There's constant yearning, and I think that that's a good thing about YA fantasies, is because since there's like no spice in YA fantasies, you can focus more on the yearning between the characters. And I think the slow burn is more developed in YA fantasy books compared to new adult fantasy books. This is one of my favorite series of all time. Shadowhunter universe is amazing, and I will recommend this whole entire world to anybody because there's like multiple series in this book, and apparently she's supposed to come out with another one like next year also, so I'm excited to read that as well. And then the next book is Powerless. This book is a lot more romance than fantasy. This one follows a character named Peyton, and Peyton is an ordinary, and she has to go through these trials, like think of the Hunger Games, because her name is entered into the contest and she has to use her powers to get her way out. But unfortunately, she doesn't have any powers, and ordinaries are kind of executed for not having any powers, and she pretends to be a psychic. And Kai is one of the princes of the royal family. He is sort of the enforcer also. The enforcer is the leader of a group that the king has tasked to go and kill anybody who doesn't have any magical powers. And she is really good at reading people, so she understands how to use this sort of like con to get past all of these trials. And then slowly, while she's going through these trials, she and Kai start sort of like form a relationship. And it's a story of he falls first and falls way harder. The way Kai speaks to her is so swoon-worthy, and yeah, it gets kind of cringy at times, but this one, if you are looking for a fantasy that is not so serious in the world building, this one would be a really good recommendation because it's not that heavy at all. In all honesty, the fantasy is just sort of like the background part of it, and the romance it's more prominent. So I highly recommend this one. It's a trilogy. The third book is going to come out in April called Fearless, and the second book was okay for me, but the first book is by far superior. And the last YA book, and my favorite of the bunch, is Throne of Glass. Throne of Glass is an 8-book series written by Sarah J. Maas, and this book is amazing. It starts off YA, but there is sort of like a little bit of like spice that ends up showing up in maybe the last couple of books, but not as heavy as any of the new adult books, so it's very, very still YA. It follows a character named Selena, and Selena is an assassin, and she is in the salt mines kind of like paying out her time because she's in prison because of things that happen. There's a contest that is being run by the king where they're trying to find the king's champion. And the prince, named Prince Dorian, asks Selena to be his assassin. And he wants her to join the contest, and he tells her that if she ends up winning this contest, she just has to serve for 3 years, and she gets her freedom right afterwards. So of course she's going to take it because she doesn't want to spend her life in the slave mines. And she ends up joining this contest. The first book is very trial-based, but as the series goes on, this book deviates so much from the first plot, and it gets so much bigger, and the world gets so much bigger, and there's sort of like war that has to happen also. When I first heard about this book, when I heard that it was about an assassin, I kept thinking to myself, how are they gonna write 8 books about an assassin? But as I kept reading, the world gets so much bigger, and it becomes bigger plot than I ever thought it could be. And this book has become one of my favorite series of all time, and I highly recommend this book to anyone who wants to have a great fantasy book to read that is well fleshed out with a bunch of characters and different POVs that you could follow. And it's set in a fae world, and fae is more like a different type of fairy, and I highly recommend this book. I know it's an 8-book series, it's a long series to get into, so I'd probably wait after reading the other books to get into this one because it is a lot of world building, but it's so good. You get so attached to the characters, and highly recommend this series. The next little category I have is sort of like more of the cozy fantasy, less stakes kind of fantasy. Those are like my least favorite ones because I tend to kind of get bored in cozy fantasies because I like high stakes. I like knowing that there's something that might happen to the characters that makes me care about them more. This is sort of more of a contemporary romance set in sort of a fancy world, or it has like fantasy elements in it. This is called the Ex Hex. So imagine where if you take Stars Hollow from Gilmore Girls and give it the humor of Sabrina the Teenage Witch and have the magic of practical magic, you have the Ex Hex. It has comedy, it has magic, it has a sort of plot that you kind of follow throughout the whole entire time where the town is kind of cursed, and there's a romance between Vivian and Reese. Reese Penhallow is from London. He and Vivian sort of like had a summer fling like 9 years ago, and I guess Reese broke her heart. As a way to get over him, she and her cousin decided to do sort of like a curse on him, not thinking that the curse would would actually happen. And he comes back, and then they run into each other, and then he ends up getting all these unfortunate incidents happened upon him, and it goes on from there. And I really liked it. It wasn't the best, of course. I loved how it was very comedic, how the fantasy was very tiny sprinkling, so this one is a way to dip your toes into it as well, especially if you're coming from contemporary romance. This would be a good transition. Another book I would suggest is The Secret Society of Irregular Witches. This follows a character who is a witch, but she has to hide her powers because she's a part of this secret society where people don't normally have magical powers, and she's part of these witches who are very secretive of their powers. And I guess she films YouTube videos where she uses sort of like stage magic, but it's actually magic that she does, but to her viewers it's just stage magic, you know? And someone contacts her and asks her to come tutor these 3 young witches. The person who contacts them says that they know that she has actual magical powers, and these 3 witches are very young and they need guidance. So she comes over to help out in this tiny little cozy house, and there's a grumpy librarian. So again, if you're coming from contemporary romance and want to dip your toes into fantasy, this would be a good bet. It's like urban fantasy, I want to say, because it is sort of like set in modern world. There's cell phones, there's cameras, there's cars. It's very found family based. I love the little found family she has, and it's very like cute. So I would highly recommend that as well, because it's not heavy to get into whatsoever. And then the last one for like cozy fantasy is Divine Rivals. If you like letter-based books that are, you know, the main form of communication between characters in this book, you would love Divine Rivals. Iris is the main character, and she is a reporter, and she's trying to get a position in her company that would get her more money and obviously more time to do headlines and everything. But she has unfortunately a work rival named Roman, and they both are trying to go after the same position. It's set in a world where there's a fight going on between gods, and there's a big war going on where the humans are being forced to fight for either side, and they have to choose which side to go to. Her brother Forrest ends up getting deployed to go for one of the sides of the gods. Humans are just set in a world where they have to deal with the consequences of these gods. The first book mainly focuses on the love story. She tries to write to her brother. She doesn't know where her brother is, and he's deployed, so unfortunately she can't really send it to him, and she puts it in this wardrobe, and then she discovers the next morning that the letter is gone from the wardrobe, and she gets a letter back the next day from a mysterious writer. It's dual POV, and it starts becoming this big thing where they start writing back and forth to each other, and the writing is so amazing in this. Rebecca Ross knows how to write her love stories, so if you again want to dip your toes into fantasy and want to have a little love story as well, pick up Divine Rivals, especially if you love beautiful writing. Very lyrical. I love this writing so much, and the ending made me cry. So it's a duology as well, and it's completed. And the next genre is romantasy. Romantasy, fantasy, romance. I think there's a difference between the two. Romantasy is more of a romance set in a world of fantasy. Fantasy romance is a fantasy story that has a little bit of a love story in there. But these are my like favorite romantasies of all time, and these are ones I highly recommend, especially if you want a mixture of both romance and fantasy. And of course, starting off with the biggest one, which is ACOTAR. ACOTAR is one of the most popular romantasy books of all time. It follows a character who is a human, and she lives in the mortal world with her sisters. They have an impoverished lifestyle, and she is the youngest and has to go hunt for her family because unfortunately her dad can't go work because of like an injury he has, and her 2 sisters refuse to do anything, so she has to be the one who goes out and gets food for them. And unfortunately one day she ends up killing this wolf who you find out is a magical being, and in return they have sort of like a treaty in between the Fae world and the mortal world where they can't go into each other's territories. It kind of like breaks the treaty, and as punishment she has to, it's basically a life for a life. Either she has to die, or she can go off to the fairy world and live with the lord of this world. And of course she takes the latter one because she wants to live, of course, and it goes bigger from there. Number one thing that it goes into is romance. The plot is more like the background, but if you get into the third book it becomes more of like a war-based one. But this book becomes bigger than what it is. Like the difference between this book and the second book, it's wild. but it's definitely wild. So if you don't like the first book, maybe go on to the second one, because the first one does not describe what the overall plot is at all. It's very, very similar to Throne of Glass, where the first book is like, oh, okay, this is all it is. The first book is more of a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, or reimagining, but as you go on, it gets further from that and it just becomes bigger, and I highly recommend it. Again, one of my favorite series of all time. It's very popular and it's well deserved. Next book is Spark of the Everflame. This book is a part of the Kindred's Curse saga. I have a reading vlog of this, reading the first 2 books. This book is going to be a 4-book series, but the 4th book is yet to release, and there's only 3 books out right now. And this follows a character named DM, and she is a healer, and she lives in the mortal world, and the mortals are separated from the descendants. The descendants are sort of like the ones who are the people who have like magical abilities, and they are more of the richer, higher class beings, whereas the mortals have to live in impoverished worlds. And she unfortunately has her mom disappear. Her mom is like the main healer of the whole entire city, so she has to sort of start taking care of her responsibilities. Her mom was also the healer of one of the descendants in secret. She has to go take over for that, and she of course has prejudices against like the descendants, because the descendants are like rich and don't help out with the mortals at all, and the mortals are just sort of like their playthings to them and get disregarded. She of course doesn't like them, and she ends up getting to know someone named Luther, and Luther is one of the princes of the royal family, and she ends up finding out all these secrets. And this one is really good too, because imagine like sort of like demigods, like similar to Percy Jackson. It's not Greek mythology whatsoever, at least I don't think. It has a big magical world also, so this one would be great if you're just like looking for a romantasy. And next, I have to talk about Fourth Wing. Fourth Wing took TikTok by storm and is still one of the most popular romantasies over the past couple years. In case you don't know, this book follows a character named Violet, and Violet is going to attend the Writer's Quadrant, and she doesn't want up any part of it because she was trained all her life to be a part of the Scribe Quadrant, who are more academic, scholarly based. But her mom, of course, doesn't want it because she is the general of the school, and she says that Violet has to join the Writer's Quadrant because her older sister and her older brother both are writers, and her mom is a writer too, so there's no question on whether or not she has to join. But unfortunately, Violet has sort of like a disability that makes it harder for her to be able to ride dragons and everything, because it requires a lot of like strength. She is forced to enter into the Writer's Quadrant, where there are very high stakes, where anyone can die at any minute. Within the first chapter, you understand how high stakes everything is. I absolutely love this series with my whole entire heart. I think it's one of the most addicting series out there, and I love the characters in it and the love story. This is absolutely enemies to lovers. It's so good. The tension, the banter, I absolutely love this world. And also the dragons are like main characters also. Dragons are hilarious. They have their own agency because they're the ones who choose the writer, and unfortunately, because not many dragons willing to bond to cadets, they have to pick and choose the best ones. So the dragons who are featured in this world are hilarious, and I absolutely love them. And Rebecca Yarros has a way of making you get so attached to these characters, so I highly recommend. Again, another one of my top favorite series, and if you want to get into fantasy, this is a good book because it's very easy introduction to fantasy. Next book is Metal Slinger. Metal Slinger became huge over the last year. Metal Slinger was originally indie published, but now Rachel Schneider recently announced that this is getting traditionally published, which is well deserved because this book is so good. There's a huge plot twist at the end that I didn't see coming whatsoever, but this book is set in a fantasy world where the character named Bryn is from Alaha, which is sort of like a water-based kind of like village. They're not a part of the land, and they go into Kenta one day because she's a part of the guard that is able to visit the Kenta market, and Kenta is on land. And unfortunately, because of an incident, it causes a disagreement between the Kentas and the Alahas, and she has to escape with her life. And it goes on from there because she ends up getting tracked by one of the guards from Kenta, and it goes on from there because they go on a whole entire journey. And it's sort of like a water-based adventure, but then halfway through they sort of like get on land, and you find out there's like magical powers also. And this one is again one of those books where it's just set in a fantasy world where the romance is the main plot. This again has great tension, great banter between the two characters, and I was unsure about the main character at first, but he grew on me, and the plot twist was so huge, so I absolutely recommend this. Even if you've never read any fantasies in your life, this one would be a great great book to pick up right away, especially if you want to be more into the new adult range rather than the young adult. The second to last book I want to talk about is Serpent and the Wings of Night. This book is a part of the Crowns of Nyaxia duology, and I guess like this whole entire world is going to be 6 books, but it's 6 books that are sort of separated into duologies. So the first duology is Serpent and the Wings of Night and Ashes and the Starcursed King, and this follows a character named Araya, and Araya is a human who is the daughter of a vampire. He sort of like adopts her after an incident when she's younger, and she becomes his child. Like, she knows the whole entire vampire world, and she ends up joining this trial contest where the prize at the end is for a goddess to grant a wish, and her wish is to become immortal and become a vampire. And so she goes through this whole entire trial, and she ends up running to a vampire named Rain, who is a part of a different faction of vampires, and they end up becoming allies and helping one another because she is immortal in a trial that is surrounded by vampires, and he's a vampire who would understand how to help her out. And so throughout this whole entire thing, they end up like sort of like falling in love, and again it's a whole entire like big cliffhanger at the end too. Thankfully the second book's out, their story is done, and it sets off into another duology, and you don't necessarily have to continue on with the series if you don't want to. You can read the first 2, and there's also a novella in between as well if you prefer vampires over the other fantasy characters, especially if you're more used to vampires than you are to fairies, to fays, to other creatures that are not like, you know, not more of the popular ones. So I would highly recommend this if you love vampires. I thought I wouldn't want to ever pick up another vampire fantasy after Twilight, but with Serpent and the Wings of Night, I absolutely fell in love with it. I highly recommend this, especially if you're looking for a really good time, especially if it's action-packed and if you like trial-based books. And the last book I want to talk about is a recent fantasy favorite of mine, which is Quicksilver. It follows a character named Saris, and she lives in the mortal world. As you can tell, there's common themes in a lot of these romantasy books where the female always starts off in a mortal world, or she's mortal herself. Something happens where these characters get thrown into a magical world or is a part of a magical plot, where in this case Saris is immortal and she and her brother are the only ones left, and they have to like live through stealing and doing whatever they can to get by and survive. And so she unfortunately ends up stealing from one of the guards and then gets in trouble by the queen, and while she's getting punished by the queen, she ends up opening this world to a different universe which is fae based, and she finds out in this world that she has sort of like a magical ability that helps with sort of manipulating metals, and she's an alchemist, and she runs into a character named Kingfisher, and Kingfisher is a fae, and he is so rough around the edges. He's very morally gray, and when you meet him for the first time, it's kind of hard for you to get through some of the stuff that he says because he has a filthy mouth. He is so filthy towards the female main character at first, but then as you slowly get to know him as the character goes on, and you slowly start to see them kind of like becoming friends and then start falling for each other, and it's so good, and you start falling for Kingfisher yourself. This book has a lot of mixture of different things. There's fae, there's vampires, there's so many things, but again, it's so easy to get into. I love this world so much, and the second book is supposed to come out in November called Brimstone, and this book I highly recommend, and it was such a 6-star read for me, especially if you're a beginner in fantasy. Anyways, that is all my different recommendations for getting into fantasy, especially if you're a beginner. I have so many more books to talk about, but I think I'm gonna do that into different like other books, intermediate and expert, because we can be here for hours, because I mainly read fantasy. But thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.